Hello and welcome back to Rev Real Estate School. I'm your host, Michael Montgomery, and today we're talking about how you can select a geofarm in real estate. Now, geofarming is one of these tried and true prospecting methods, but where most agents go wrong is in two places. First off, they select the wrong farm. They don't know where to actually go in order to start a geofarm, and are they starting it in the right spot? And secondly, they lack consistency. So it's going to take you at least 1 year in order to recoup what you are putting into your farm, both in time and in investment dollars. And we have to be prepared to put in the reps over the course of a year in order to see if this farm will actually pan out. Today, what we're going to discuss is how you can select that right farm. So then all you have to do is be consistent. So tip number one, and this isn't 100% required, but where a lot of people move to and from can be suburbs and downtown. So suburbs and downtown areas can be great geofarms simply because their turnover rate tends to be higher. Now we're going to discuss this more, but if you are just looking for a cheat code in order to get started, consider both suburbs and downtown. Now, that's not to say to just discount anything that doesn't fall into a suburb category and doesn't fall into the downtown category. Instead, this can just be a good way for us to get started because those areas tend to have more turnover. And there's actually a good reason for this. People are moving to the suburbs and they realize their commute into downtown becomes too long. And so they want to move closer to downtown. And then the opposite is true for downtown folks. It becomes too busy. Maybe their family's growing and they need more space. So they move from downtown to a suburb. So if you are just getting started, these can be two key areas to get started in when you are thinking about which area should you actually be focusing on. But we're going to jump into more detail as to how you can decide which community to actually zero in on. So the second tip is you don't need to live there, but living there or living close to your farm will definitely help. And that's because we can't just do this all by mail. Yes, mailers are important, but we also have to show our face in the farm. And if this farm is too far to commute to, we're not going to be able to show up there enough. We need to be willing to show up in the farm and be face to face with people 2 to 3 times a week. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're door knocking or that we're doing anything real estate related 2 to 3 times a week. But if you're working, you might as well go work in a coffee shop in your farm. If you're going out for lunch with a client, you might as well select your farm as the place that you go out for lunch because from there, you're going to meet more people. So if the drive is too far, or if the community doesn't speak to you in the sense that you don't want to be there 2 to 3 times a week, then it's probably the wrong community to go with. But again, you don't necessarily need to live there. Living there does help, but you don't have to. Another way you can think about this is you may choose a community that you don't necessarily live in, but you really want to live in. Now, this can be very helpful because we can be very excited about the community. We can dive deep into the community, and we also want to be looking at real estate in the community because we eventually may want to move there. So these farms can also be great as areas where we want to move. So both areas that we live in, adjacent areas, so areas that are very, very close to us, or future areas that we could see ourselves moving to. Now, that's not to say you can't go across town, but be prepared that the time investment for you to drive to that farm is going to be higher. And so when I'm analyzing my farm, if it's going to be further from me and it's going to take more driving time and the chances of me showing up there are less, then I'm basically going to say that this farm may end up not being as preferable as some other ones. So this farm will have to just blow everything else out of the park when it comes to its turnover rate, its average price, and then my affinity to the community in order to make that drive on a regular basis. Now, another thing to keep in mind when you're selecting your farm is it can be ideal if there are various price points. Again, not a requirement to have various price points, but it'd be really nice if there are entry homes, if there are move-up homes, if there are luxury homes. And the reason for this is you can end up matching people with your listings. So you have somebody selling their first-time home buyer home and want to move to the move-up home, and hey, you have that inventory. You know somebody who's looking to sell. And oftentimes these people can want to move to the same community. And so this can be very, very key is to have different price points within your farm. Again, it's not a requirement because some farms are just going to be luxury farms and some farms are going to be first-time home buyer farms, and that's perfectly fine as well. But if there is some discrepancy in prices, this can be great. And it also allows us to get a few quick wins typically with lower priced condos or homes and then eventually move our way more into the luxury realm if that's the direction we'd like to go. We're going to talk more about this as we continue. Next, we have turnover rate. So no discussion about geofarming is complete without understanding turnover rate. And turnover rate is basically the percentage of homes in that given farm that sell every year. Now, turnover rate is incomplete unto itself. If you only select a farm based on turnover rate, you're going to be missing a few dimensions of this. The first dimension is you have to like the community. So if there's a large turnover rate because nobody likes that community and you agree and you don't care for that community, then that's not a great community for you. You have to actually be drawn to the community because you are going to become involved. You're going to become part of that community. Your face is going to be synonymous with the community. But that being said, we also don't want to select a community that has a very low turnover. So how do we define low turnover? Well, ultimately, if we have a turnover rate between about 4 to 6%, we're in a pretty good spot. If we're sub 3%, then we tend to be a little bit low. And if we're sub 3%, it can be quite challenging for us to actually build up our inventory and actually get sales in that community because people love it so much they just stick around forever. Now, if you have a very high turnover rate, that can offer a lot of opportunities for us. But the other thing to keep in mind, as we already discussed, are people leaving that community because they don't like it? Or B, because there's so much turnover rate, do we have other agents that are farming it? So higher turnover rate tends to be better, but we also want to be cautious. We don't just want to select based on turnover rate alone. This leads us directly into the next step. So when we are selecting a farm, we also need to know our competition. And in these areas with higher turnover rate, oftentimes people are inundated with agents that are trying to farm those communities. So sometimes the highest turnover rate doesn't end up being the best farm for us because it's so heavily farmed. So the next step here is to understand how heavily farmed are your areas that you're considering. And the way that we do this is honestly just pulling it up on MLS and seeing if one agent has over 20% of the market share. Now, if one agent has over 20% of the market share, and I have farmed areas where that is the case, then we need to understand how are we going to differentiate ourselves from that agent. And sometimes this can actually be quite easy. So if we are going into a neighborhood and somebody has 25% market share, but they're not doing much by way of marketing, they're not very well known in the community, or their business is slowing down, this can be a great time to get in there. Because now you can have a fresh new marketing approach for that community. That being said, if we are seeing agents with over 20% of the market share, we want to proceed with caution. We don't want to cross it off. And then the second metric we're going to look at is if 2 to 3 agents have over 40% of the market share. So if you accumulate 2 or 3 of the top agents in that community, do they have more than 40% of the market share together? If so, it's going to be more competitive. Now, competitive is not necessarily a bad thing. Having some competition is great. Oftentimes people will want to farm communities where there is a lot of potential. But that being said, we need to know what we're up against. So up until now, we've selected a few communities, maybe some downtown, maybe some in the suburbs, maybe some in between. We've also determined that, hey, we can get to this community. We're happy to be there 2 to 3 times a week. We found the turnover rates, and those turnover rates fall anywhere between about 4 to 6%, ideally. And then now we've also determined, are we competing with any agents? And not that competing with agents is going to scare us off, but we just have to be prepared with our approach. And we also have to be understanding of how long it's going to take to actually break into the market, especially if it's heavily farmed. Next, we're going to select the number of homes. And now, really when it comes to the number of homes, it's up to you. But what I suggest starting with is start with 500. You can start with a little less, you can start with a little more, but depending on your budget, start with 500 homes. Because 500 homes is kind of this magical number where it is knockable in the sense that you could go around and door knock the majority of it. Now, knocking 500 homes in one day would be a lot, but over the course of a month, you can probably end up door knocking those. And so we want it to be small enough that we can put in the sweat equity of actually door knocking, but we want it large enough where we're actually going to get a listing or two. And so 500 homes can be a really good place to start. Now, if you have a little bit of a budget built up, you may want to push into 1,000, 1,500, or 2,000, but don't go too far above that when you're first getting into farming because you need to understand how this is going to work. If you do have quite a bit more of a budget, then you can go up from there. But if you're just starting out, and if you don't have a ton of sales under your belt, starting with 500 or even 1,000 can be a really good starting place. And when you're thinking about these 500 homes, it can be worthwhile thinking about how you're going to be interacting with them and what it's going to cost you. When you're starting to budget out what you're going to do, we're going to get to that in a moment. But just think about, you're going to be sending out at least one postcard a month. So you're going to be sending out some sort of market-related postcard a month. And then you're also going to have just listed, just solds, and coming soons that are be going out to these houses. And then finally, once a quarter, you're going to have a market report, quite an in-depth market report that goes out to all these homes. So when you start adding that up month over month, the cost and time can go up dramatically. And that's why starting with this 500, 1,000, or even a little bit less than 500 if you'd like is a great way to get started in geofarming. Next, let's look at the math. So we also need to understand what is the economic potential of this geofarm. Don't just flock to the geofarms with the highest average sale price. And there's a few reasons for this. First off, they tend to take a little bit longer to sell. Second, they can be very heavily farmed. And third, they can just be more of a challenge to break into. That's not to say don't focus on them, because oftentimes agents see the luxury market as the place that they want to go. However, there can be a ton of transactions in these suburban markets at around your average sale price for your city. This can be a really good place to start. Now, it can be nice to be in a community where there is some luxury, there are some move-up homes, and there are some first-time homebuyer homes. Again, this can be a really good strategy, but don't just fixate on average price. So what you're going to do is you're going to look at your farm, you're going to look over the last year, how many homes sold, and then from there, you are going to determine what is the total commission for those homes sold. So you're going to look at, let's say, 5 to 10 homes that sold, and you're going to calculate the commission based on the average sale price. And then from there, you're going to take 10%. So you're going to take 10% market share for your farm. Now, that's not to say you're going to have 10% market share after your first year, but we're aiming to have 10% market share by the end of the second year. So what this will help us do is if we're aiming for that, if we're aiming to have 10% market share by the end of our second year, we can start to reverse engineer that. And a really good way to start with your marketing budget is take 10% market share, look at the GCI that would come from that, the gross commission income, and then from there, you have your 10% and then you take a third of that. So you have your 10% market share, what's the income that could come from that, and what's a third of that? And then take that 1/3 and invest that into your farm. Now, this is a risk because we actually need to realize that income. We have to actually sell those homes in order for that income to come in, but it can be a really good starting place when it comes to budgeting. We can understand if we have 10% market share, what does that look like on a GCI basis? And then what's a third of that we could reinvest into our farm? And it really helps us get a starting place for what we can spend in our farm. So put these strategies to work when you are analyzing farms. And you don't just want to analyze one farm. You need to analyze a few different farms, a few different geographic locations. Now, this is a long-term play. We should take our time finding our farm and selecting it. We should preview homes. We should really look at the turnover rate. We should go and see what businesses are in the area. We have to spend some time in that farm because your first year is not going to produce a ton of income. Farming is a long-term game. So you don't want to just have this farm for 1 year. You want to have this farm for 20 years. So you better really like the community and take the time that you need in order to analyze the farm so that you are making the right decision. Thank you very much for tuning in this episode. Reach out to me anytime on Instagram at the.michael.montgomery or head over to revrealestateschool.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next lesson.